It's story time. The story begins. Let the words enter your mind. Neurons fire away deep into Imagination Central. There, any adventure can play out. Waves of blooming wildflowers roll in the summer breeze. Butterflies flutter across the field, drifting up into the sky. You build a Persian palace from shadowy memories. Inside, sitting on his ottoman in flowing silk robes, a sultan speaks to his emissary, his eyes drawn thin as he issues a challenge to his people to bring him a riddle he cannot solve. You enter Storyland. Now your heightened focus turns to today's storyteller.
Hi, my name is Wynn Montgomery, and I'm a storyteller. One of the organizations I tell stories for is Spellbinders, which is an organization here in Colorado that puts storytellers in school classrooms once a month. And if you're interested in that, you can find out more about Spellbinders at www.spellbinders.org. And I got a couple of stories I'd like to share with you today. The first one is called The Three Dolls. Long ago, in ancient Persia, there was a sultan whom everybody knew to be the richest and wisest of all the sultans. Now, his riches, he mostly kept to himself, but he liked to show off his wisdom by solving puzzles and riddles and enigmas. And he was quite good at that. It seems that no matter what kind of puzzle he was presented with, he'd look at it, he'd stroke his long gray beard, and he'd give you the answer. And it was always the right answer. And as much fun as that was, he soon got bored. He wanted more challenges. He thought all these puzzles are far too easy. And so he sent out a decree declaring that anyone who could give him a puzzle that stumped him would receive a treasure chest filled with gold and silver and jewels, and they'd be rich beyond their wildest dreams. And of course, the puzzles started pouring in. And they were harder than the ones he was used to. Some took him much longer to solve, but solve them he always did. And then one day, a package arrived at his palace. Small box wrapped in silk. When he unwrapped it, he found a wooden box. He lifted the lid of that box, and inside were three wooden dolls dressed in silk robes, and they looked identical. He picked one up and he looked at it carefully, and he was admiring the craftsmanship, and then he saw a note in the box. And the note said, "Your task is this: find the difference in these three dolls." And the Sultan thought, wow, this is great. Now I've got a puzzle to solve. So he carefully examined each doll, and they appeared to be identical. The patterns on the silk robes were identical. Even the grain in the wood was identical. He thought, well, they really look alike. How could they be different? Maybe they smell different. And so he carefully smelled each of the three dolls, and each smelled exactly the same, smelled like sandalwood. And he thought, well, they look alike, they smell alike. I wonder if they sound any different. And so he shook each one next to his ear, and none of them made a sound. They were equally silent. And then he thought, okay, they look alike, they smell alike, they sound alike, they feel like they weigh the same, but maybe there's a slight difference. So he got very carefully calibrated scales, and he weighed each one of those dolls, and they weighed exactly the same amount. And now he was pulling on that long gray beard even harder. And a crowd was starting to gather because the word had spread that maybe the Sultan had met his match. And Finally, he decided, you know, I need help. So he called who was supposed to be the wisest man in his kingdom, the scholar who had spent his entire life in libraries, reading. Supposedly he had read almost every book ever written. He was supposed to know everything. And the Sultan explained the problem. And the scholar said, oh, sire, the answer is before us like a book. We just have to read it. And so the scholar, he looked at the dolls carefully. He smelled the dolls. He shook the dolls. He weighed the dolls. He could find no difference. And so he shrugged, put the dolls down, and stormed out of the room. As he left the room, the fool bounced into the room. The fool, the court jester, and he greeted the Sultan like he always did. He said, hey, Sultan baby, how you doing? And when did you start playing with girly toys? And how do you tell them apart? And the Sultan thought, well, you know, sometimes a fool can see things that a wise man can't see. So he carefully explained the problem. And the fool didn't appear to be listening to him. He was more interested in those dolls as playthings. He was juggling them. And then he did a strange thing. He licked one of the dolls. And then he licked the other one. And then he licked the third one. And then he said, Sultan baby, you got a real problem here. Because not only do these dolls look alike and smell alike and sound alike, they taste alike. And with that, he dropped the dolls and danced out of the room. Well, the crowd is getting bigger and the Sultan's getting more and more confused, and he's pulling on his beard harder and harder. And he thinks, well, who can help me? The scholar can't help me. The fool can't help me. Who can help me? And out of the crowd steps a storyteller. And the storyteller says, sire, when I've found that although people often look alike, they're different inside. And so the difference in these dolls must be inside. And as a storyteller, I know that the best way to get inside someone is through their ears. And so before anybody could react, he reached over and he grabbed a long gray hair out of that Sultan's long gray beard. And he stuck it in the ear of the first doll. And as everyone watched, the hair went in, it went in, it went in, and then it disappeared. And the storyteller said, well, sire, this doll is like a scholar. What goes in his ear stays in his head for future use. And then he picked up the second doll, and even though the Sultan was somewhat ready, he still snatched a long gray hair out of that long gray beard, and he stuck it in the second doll's ear. And as the Sultan watched, the hair went in one ear and slowly, ever so slowly, out the other ear. And the storyteller smiled again, and he said, well, sire, this doll is like a fool. What goes in one ear comes out the other. And then the Sultan actually leaned forward so that the storyteller could yank a long gray hair out of his long gray beard. And he took the third doll and he put the hair in the ear. And they watched as he pushed it in, pushed it in, pushed it in. And slowly it spiraled out of the mouth of the doll. And the storyteller smiled and said, well, sire, this doll is like a storyteller. What he hears, he soon shares with others. And the Sultan smiled and he said, well, okay. He said, you have solved one of the problems. You solved the problem I brought you, but you created another problem. And the storyteller says, what's that? And the Sultan said, well, the hair that went in the third doll's ear, it was straight. When it came out of its mouth, it was twisted like a screw. Why is that? And the storyteller said, well, sire, that is even further proof that this doll is like a storyteller. Because no storyteller worth his salt would tell a story exactly the way he heard it. Each storyteller is going to put his own special twist on the story. And the Sultan clapped his hands and he said, bravo. And since he didn't know who had given him the puzzle, he gave the treasure chest to the storyteller, making the storyteller much richer than most storytellers are. And then he gave him the 3 dolls. And the storyteller kept those 3 dolls and used them for the rest of his days to explain the art of storytelling. The first storyteller I ever knew was my grandfather, who I called Pop. And I try to keep his memory alive by sharing stories about him or stories he told me. And this is one of my favorites. It's called Pop Buys a Gift. My grandfather Pop's best friend for his entire life was his first cousin, Mutt. They were almost exactly the same age. They were born the same year. They grew up on neighboring farms in North Georgia. They inherited those farms, and so they were neighbors for the rest of their lives. And then eventually they died about in the same year. And they saw each other, so for their entire lives, they saw each other almost every day. And they never ran out of things to talk about. They talked about hunting, they talked about fishing, they talked about their favorite sport, baseball, they talked about the weather, they talked about politics, they talked about their neighbors, they talked about their wives, they even talked about their neighbors' wives. And one of the signs of their mutual admiration was that whenever one of them had a birthday, the other one gave him a special gift of some kind. And since these were poor Georgia dirt farmers, they didn't have any money. So most of the time, those gifts were handmade. It might be a whistle carved out of a twig. It might be a hand-tied fishing lure. It might be a hand-carved duck decoy. It might be a ham from Pop's Smokehouse. It might be honey from Mutt's beehive. On a good year, it might be a jug of muscadine wine. But whatever it was, those gifts were always carefully chosen, cheerfully given, and gratefully received. So you can imagine how upset Pop was when one year he was out of town in New York City, the only time he ever went to New York City in his entire life, and he realized that for reasons beyond his control, he couldn't get home in time for Mutt's birthday. And he was really, it was not just an ordinary birthday, it was one of those with a zero on the end of it. Mutt was turning 50. And so Pop was wandering the streets of New York, really depressed, thinking, what can I do for Mutt? I can't call him, he doesn't have a phone, and maybe a telegram would do, but that seems sort of impersonal. So as he's walking, he turns down a side street, and he sees over on his right a pet store with a sign in the window that says, come in and meet the world's only baseball bird. Well, I've already told you Pop and Mutt talked baseball. They loved baseball. So Pop had to see this. He went in, and he walks in the door, and sitting right in front of the door is a stand, and sitting on that stand is a bird, and it's the ugliest bird Pop has ever seen. Looks kind of like a parrot, shaped like a parrot, but it's just brown and dingy, and about half its feathers seem to be falling off, and it's just an ugly bird. And Pop thinks, well, this can't possibly be the baseball bird. But just then, the owner of the pet store comes out, and he said, sir, let me introduce you to the baseball bird. And he takes a baseball, and he said, let me show you what this bird can do. And so he takes the ball in his right hand, and he holds it out toward the bird, looks that bird right in the eye, and the bird looks at the ball, and he goes, ah, the outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville Nine that day. And that bird proceeds to recite Casey at the bat from start to finish. And when he finishes that, the club owner, the store owner, changes the ball to this hand, holds it in front of the bird, and the bird looks at it and starts to sing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." He sings "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" all the way through in English, and then he sings it in Spanish, and then he sings it in French, and he eventually sings that song in 7 different languages. And then the store owner takes the ball and he holds it like this, and the bird and looks at the bird, looks him right in the eye, and he says, Babe Ruth. And the bird says, ah, the Bambino. And then the owner says, Lou Gehrig. And the bird says, ah, the Iron Horse. And with that, Pop snatches the ball out of his hand and says, let me try that. And he holds the ball out, and like anybody from Georgia would do, he says, Ty Cobb. And the bird says, ah, the Georgia Peach. Well, Pop decides this would probably make a great birthday present for Mutt. He doesn't usually spend money, but he's got to do it. This is a special occasion. So he starts haggling with the store owner. And they haggle and they haggle and they haggle, and finally they agree on a price. And Pop digs in his pocket, hands over the money, and Pop is now the owner of the world's only baseball bird. Well, after the bird is his, he explains to the shop owner why he wanted that bird so bad. And the shop owner is so touched by that story of male bonding that he says, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. For no extra money at all, I'm going to ship this bird to Georgia for you, and I'll guarantee you it'll get there in time for Mutt's birthday. So Pop thinks that's a great idea. He writes a happy birthday note, throws it in the cage. The owner throws the ball in the cage with the bird, and Pop leaves. Well, it takes him a while to get home, and he doesn't get home till 2 or 3 days after Mutt's birthday, but he can't wait to find out what Mutt thinks about the baseball bird. So he races in the house, he drops his suitcase, pecks his wife on the cheek, and runs next door to see Mutt. Knocks on Mutt's door, and Mutt comes to the door, and Pop says, Mutt, did you get that birthday present I sent you, that bird I sent you for your birthday? And Mutt said, yeah, I got it. And Pop said, well, what'd you think about it? Mutt said, oh, it was delicious. Pop said, Mutt, you didn't eat that bird. Said, that bird could recite Casey at the bat. That bird could sing, take me out to the ball game in 7 different languages. That bird could tell you the nicknames of 100 baseball players. How could you possibly have eaten him? So that was a talking bird. Mutt said, well, he didn't say anything to me. And Pop said, well, did you show him the baseball? And Mutt said, no, that baseball was nasty. It had been lying in the bottom of a bird cage for 2 or 3 days. Said, I wouldn't touch it. Well, with that, Pop and Mutt looked at each other, started laughing, gave each other a big man hug, and Pop told me that was the last time either one of them ever bought a birthday present.